Well, another public interest before corporate interest presentation, but today I'm actually going to talk about the organisation behind this YouTube channel. Public interest before corporate interest was formed in 2015 after the federal election. It was formed by 7 people. Of those original 7, 3 are still involved, 2 have died and 2 have moved on. But the concept was very simple. It was to register a new political party, which is based on the concept of putting the interests of the many, that's the public, before the interests of the few, that's the corporate sector. Because as we've seen through these various YouTube presentations, that many of the problems which we face in Australia today are directly linked to the manipulation and the concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and most of the parliamentary decisions which have been made over the past 40 years or so have promoted that deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation agenda. Now I know you're sick of hearing it, but the dilemma is that things have got worse, not better, for a significant proportion of the population. Now obviously, being able to access finances through the financial sector has to a significant degree been able to paper over the problems which we face as a community. That is until interest rates started to increase and they began to have an effect on mortgage holders and people with personal loans and people with business loans. So public interest before corporate interests expected to be registered as a federal political party within a few years, because at that particular point in time registration required 500 members. Unfortunately, 3 or 4 years ago legislation was passed, well actually about 2.5 years ago legislation was passed which increased the membership from 500 members to 1,500 members before you could register a federal political party. So not even having 500 members at that particular point in stage, it was almost impossible without having a paid organiser to assist in recruitment that we'd actually reach the numbers. So we put our efforts towards the state, because at the state level you only need 500 members in Victoria to register a federal state-based political party, although the numbers vary in different things. Now, what does registration as a political party means? Well, elections are expensive businesses, not just in terms of raising finances, but in terms of getting media attention. And obviously having registration assists. It also assists electorally, because especially at the federal level there are various legislative pieces in play which actually make it very difficult for independents to stand, especially in the Senate. Now the whole point about public interest before corporate interest wasn't that we expected that we would be elected to state or federal parliament, but the whole purpose was to actually raise these issues in the public domain. And we were quite successful in the first 2 or 3 years, but over the last 4 to 5 years things have almost ground to a halt, and the last 12 months has been particularly difficult, as we've actually had more members die than join. So what's the problem? Is the problem the fact that we don't have the necessary finances, or is the problem a more ideological one? Is the problem due to the fact that our particular political position is no longer relevant? the facts are that what we are saying is becoming more and more relevant. But with the election of Labor governments in every state except Tasmania, and with the election of a Labor government federally, and with the Greens taking a more radical position and expanding their agenda to take on social issues, many people believe that what we are offering is no longer relevant because these problems are being addressed through parliamentary representation. Now obviously we would disagree with that because we still have the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication dominating the political agenda. Not in terms of telling people who to vote for, but in terms of putting pressure on political parties to push certain agendas. And we see when governments get elected, even if they have a more reformist agenda, but that reformist agenda normally is lost in translation. People continue to promote the same ideas, and for a good reason. And the major reason is that the media, and I'm talking about the legacy media, is privately owned. And obviously they're based on the concept of a private investment for private profit mantra, and ultimately that is the type of agenda they will promote. Unfortunately, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as we've seen recently, is becoming more of an entertainment outlet than actually a political exchange, a forceful political exchange. And what we see is the same people promoting the same agendas. And people who don't promote that narrative, that private investment for private profit is the only way forward, find it almost impossible to get any oxygen. Now in the political process, especially if you're involved in the parliamentary elections, oxygen, as far as the media is concerned, is important. But this doesn't really address the issue why people are not interested in joining public interest before corporate interests. I mean, they can actually join online. It's very simple. There's no cost involved, and actual participation is not an onerous process. But we are now bogged. We are victims of a changing political landscape. And unless there's a potential political party, and we are not a political party, unless there's a potential political party, we are actually able to change the type of strategies we've been using, we will find it more and more difficult to actually become a parliamentary force. But the dilemma is, do we actually want to be a parliamentary force? Do we want to be in Parliament? And if we do, is public interest before corporate interest the right vehicle? Should there be a change of name? Should there be changes in policies? The dilemma is that possibly the only way forward is to actually stop trying to become a parliamentary party and remain a vehicle that promotes change, a vehicle that promotes the idea of holding wealth in common and sharing wealth and using for the common good, and a vehicle which promotes an alternative social, cultural and economic dimension to life in this country. Now obviously there's no point swimming against the tide if you're going to drown, but sometimes people survive. Not everybody who swims against the tide drowns, and sometimes you've just got to wait for the appropriate moment. But the dilemma is If you don't organise before the appropriate moment, that appropriate moment will be taken over by other forces in society. And we see this over and over again when societies collapse. We see authoritarian forces come out of the shadows and dominate the emerging political landscape. So there is a role for public interest before corporate interest, but whether that role is based on the idea of forming a parliamentary party and standing candidates in state and federal elections is still relevant, or that role should be confined to acting as a ginger group to promote various issues which result in the sharing of wealth and the devolution of power, the sharing of power. So obviously this is a fundamental decisions that members of public interest before corporate interest need to make. Whether we ever become a parliamentary party, to a significant degree, is dependent on our ability to actually convince people that what we have to offer is still relevant and will ultimately improve their lives. For example, part of our policy is the development of a third tier to the economy in a capitalist society. In Australia today we have an extraordinarily strong private sector which dominates every aspect of our existence. We have a very weak, exceptionally weak public service, or a public sector, which to a significant degree basically hands out contracts on behalf of state and federal governments to the private sector to do work which the state and federal government should be doing, things like owning and maintaining control of essential services like electricity, gas, health, education, and the list goes on and on. And even in those sections of the public sector which are still in public hands, you'll find that it's riddled with private sector organisations and employees, as we've seen with the Price Waterhouse. So we have a fundamental problem as an organisation. Do we continue on the journey to try to create initially a state-based political party and then a federal political party which participates in parliamentary elections? Is that our main focus? Or do we attempt to organise around specific issues which incorporate our policies? Or do we actually shut down the organisation and try something different? Now obviously the problems haven't changed. We still have a domination of this society by the private sector. The problems have not changed. Inequality has grown. The financial burden faced by most people has grown. Ability to secure some of the most basic necessities like housing has become more difficult. Student debt is escalating. Personal debt is escalating. I think we're the second most indebted country in the world as far as individual debt is concerned. So the issues are there. They haven't changed, they've actually got worse. But as an organisation, we haven't been able to gain the necessary traction to move forward. And it's quite interesting. Sometimes when we get new members, they want 10 application forms. They say they've got 10 people who are interested. And they come back months later and saying they couldn't actually get one person to join. There seems to be a fear in Australian society of joining organisations, especially organisations with a political focus. Whether we continue or not will be determined when we have our annual general meeting on the 1st of November this year. What type of policies, whether we have conventions after that to actually renew our policies or maintain our organisational capacity is something which will need to be debated. But in the interim, I'm encouraging all members of public interest before corporate interest to look around them and see whether there are interested people who may be interested in these concepts. Because ultimately, there is no other political organisation following a parliamentary path that actually puts forward the ideas that we have put forward. Ideas like using 1% of superannuation contributions to fund collectives and cooperatives to set up a third tier to the Australian economy. Because if only the private sector dominates, and then there is no competition. If there's no competition, we see the fiasco which we're currently seeing in childcare, aged care, healthcare, education, and the list goes on and on. So that's the dilemma. Are we willing to actually do the necessary work? It's not just a matter of signing people up. It's a matter of people joining and actually promoting these ideas in the community. You don't actually have to come to meetings, but you need to promote them in the circles you mix in. Because many of the ideas that we take for granted, most people find difficult to access, let alone understand, because they're not part of the public debate. Interestingly, when we were first formed, one of the first things we found is that the negative connotations towards the word public. Public is second rate. It's inefficient. This seems to be the philosophy that has taken hold of Australians as they embarked on this deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation gallop, believing that the wealth would trickle down to them, that they would be able to exercise power, that they would be able to share in the wealth of society as a whole. The reality is diametrically different, and will continue to be diametrically different when we believe that we are nothing more than a collection of individuals who are fighting against each other in order to acquire as much power and wealth as possible. That's what we see in the real world. Ultimately, that type of political philosophy, that type of ideology, leads to inequality, leads to destabilisation, and leads to very, very difficult outcomes for everyone. So I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest, irrespective of the ideas that I have floated. It's very simple. Go to the website, pibci.net. You can join online. If you can't join online, give us a ring on 0439 395 489, or you can always write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, and we'll send you out some application forms. Joining is easy. What is difficult is maintaining that desire for egalitarian change.